At 73, Dorothy Williams had survived the Great Recession, raised 4 children as a single mother, and built a successful catering business from her kitchen table. But according to her tech entrepreneur son and his venture capitalist wife, she was too old to understand, quote, to unearned business practices when they decided to revolutionize her life savings. What they didn't understand was that Dorothy had been watching, listening, and learning. And when you underestimate a woman who spent 7 decades mastering the art of survival, you might just discover that wisdom doesn't expire with age. It compounds with interest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dorothy Williams had always been an early riser, a habit formed during 30 years of running Sunrise Catering from the converted garage of her modest ranch home in Maple Grove, Illinois. At 73, she still woke at 4:30 a.m., though her business had been officially, quote, retired for 2 years now, sold to a corporate chain that had promised to maintain her recipes and standards. The promise, like many others she'd received lately, had proven as fragile as morning frost. She moved through her kitchen with the measured precision of someone who had prepared thousands of meals in this same space. The countertops bore the gentle wear of decades of devoted use, but they remained spotless, organized with the care of someone who understood that a home reflected its keeper's state of mind. The morning light filtered through curtains she'd sewn herself in 1989, casting familiar shadows across the linoleum flooring that her late husband Robert had installed, with meticulous attention to detail the year before their youngest daughter graduated high school. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and Dorothy reached automatically for the cabinet where Robert's favorite mug had lived for 28 years. Her fingers closed around the familiar ceramic handle, finding comfort in the ritual that connected her to memories of shared mornings when life had felt more predictable, more manageable. She opened the cabinet fully, arranging the day's necessities with the efficiency of someone whose routines had been honed by necessity rather than preference. The house carried the muffled sounds of a family that had settled into rhythms that increasingly didn't include her input. Footsteps overhead, water running through pipes, voices that seemed to float around decisions rather than inviting her participation. Her son Michael and his wife Vanessa had moved in 6 months ago, ostensibly to help her manage the complexities of modern life, while simultaneously managing their own tech startup from her converted dining room. Dorothy understood technology better than they assumed. She had digitized her catering business in 2018, maintained social media accounts that had driven significant customer acquisition, and had even dabbled in cryptocurrency investments that had paid for her new roof. But somehow, in the 6 months since the kids had moved in, she had gradually been repositioned from competent business owner to confused elderly person who needed protection from her own decision-making capabilities. The morning light climbed higher, filling the kitchen with the golden warmth that had graced thousands of family breakfasts in this house. But today, like many recent mornings, Dorothy felt the peculiar displacement of someone who was present in her own home, but somehow peripheral to its operation. She moved to the kitchen window and watched the neighborhood come alive with the familiar rhythm of a Tuesday morning in suburban Illinois. Mrs. Patterson was already tending her prize-winning rose garden next door, her movements careful but determined despite her 81 years. Across the street, the Johnsons were loading their car for what looked like a day trip, their teenage children moving with the reluctant efficiency of family obligation. The Hendersons' dog barked at something only he could see, while Mr. Chen emerged from his house in his Postal Service uniform, carrying his lunch in the same metal box he'd used for 15 years. These were her people, neighbors who had watched her children grow up, who had brought casseroles during Robert's illness, who understood the unspoken bonds that held suburban communities together across decades of change. They still treated her with the respect due to someone who had weathered life's storms and emerged with dignity intact. It was only in her own home that her competence had somehow become questionable. Dorothy returned to the kitchen counter, where yesterday's mail lay sorted into neat piles, a habit that drove Vanessa to distraction. "We can handle the bills online, Mom Williams," she would say with the patient tone reserved for the technologically impaired. "There's really no need for all this paper shuffling." But Dorothy had learned, through years of managing both household and business finances, that paper trails mattered, that physical documentation provided security that digital records couldn't always guarantee. Among the bills and advertisements lay a thick envelope from Hartwell and Associates, the investment firm that Vanessa had enthusiastically recommended 3 months ago. They specialize in wealth management for seniors, Vanessa had explained, her tone carrying the slight condescension that had become her default when discussing Dorothy's financial affairs. They'll help you understand the modern investment landscape and protect your assets from inflation. Dorothy opened the envelope with the letter opener Robert had given her for their 10th anniversary, its silver handle worn smooth by decades of use. The quarterly statement revealed what she had begun to suspect. Her conservative portfolio of bonds and blue-chip stocks had been aggressively restructured into high-risk technology investments and complex financial instruments she didn't recognize. The value had dropped by 37% in 3 months. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the fine print, not from age, but from the dawning realization that her life savings, the money she had scraped together through decades of 12-hour days, careful budgeting, and the sale of her business, had been gambled away by people who had convinced her she was too old to understand modern finance. The investments bore names like Blockchain Innovation Fund and Disruptive Technology Growth Portfolio, terms that sounded impressive but had apparently disrupted her retirement security. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced that the household was beginning to stir. Michael appeared first, 38 years old and carrying the lean intensity of someone perpetually focused on the next big opportunity. He wore the uniform of the modern entrepreneur, expensive jeans, a branded t-shirt from some tech conference, and the kind of casual confidence that came from never having experienced real financial insecurity. "Morning, Mom," he said, kissing her cheek with the automatic affection of habit. "You're up early again. You know you don't have to maintain those old catering hours anymore, right?" His smile was genuine but carried the subtle implication that her morning routine was another relic of a simpler time, like her preference for paper bills and handwritten grocery lists. Vanessa followed, 35, and polished in the way that spoke to expensive education and inherited confidence. She wore athleisure clothing that cost more than Dorothy's monthly grocery budget, her dark hair pulled back in a style that belonged in a yoga studio rather than a suburban kitchen. Her makeup was applied with the precision of someone who had never needed to choose between cosmetics and utilities. "Oh, good. You found the investment statement," Vanessa said, noticing the papers in Dorothy's hands. "I was going to walk you through those numbers later. I know all those financial terms can be confusing at first, but Harrison, that's your advisor at Hartwell, explained that some volatility is normal with growth-oriented portfolios." Dorothy looked at her daughter-in-law, this woman who had somehow acquired decision-making authority over assets Dorothy had spent 40 years accumulating. Vanessa's tone carried the brisk efficiency she had once used in her venture capital career, the voice of someone accustomed to explaining complex matters to people who weren't expected to fully understand them. "Confusing," Dorothy repeated quietly, studying the numbers that represented her financial security. "That's an interesting way to describe a 37% loss in 3 months." Michael moved to the coffee pot, pouring himself a cup in one of the sleek minimalist mugs Vanessa had gradually introduced to replace Dorothy's everyday china. "Mom, you can't look at investments like that. You have to think long-term. These are cutting-edge technologies that are going to revolutionize entire industries. Sure, there's some short-term volatility, but the potential returns are incredible." "I'm 73 years old," Dorothy said, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made both younger people pause in their morning routines. "How long-term exactly are we talking about here?" Vanessa set down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone recognizing dangerous conversational territory. "Mom Williams, I understand this might seem overwhelming, but that's exactly why we wanted to help you navigate the modern investment landscape. The old way of investing, bonds, dividend stocks, savings accounts, that doesn't work anymore with inflation and changing markets." "The old way," Dorothy said, considering the phrase. "You mean the way that turned my catering business profits into enough money to pay for this house, put 4 kids through college, and save for retirement? Of course your traditional approach worked for its time," Michael said quickly, his tone taking on the patient quality he used when explaining technology to people he considered less sophisticated. "But the financial world has evolved, Mom. Artificial intelligence, blockchain technology, biotech innovations, these are the sectors where real wealth is being created now." Dorothy folded the investment statement carefully, her movements deliberate, as she processed not just the financial loss, but the casual dismissal of the strategies that had built everything she owned. She thought about the years of planning each catering job, negotiating with suppliers, building relationships with clients who trusted her with their most important celebrations. She remembered the spreadsheets she had maintained by hand before computers, the careful budgeting that had allowed her to save while simultaneously providing for her family. And who exactly decided that my retirement savings should be creating wealth in these revolutionary sectors? She asked quietly. Vanessa and Michael exchanged a look that Dorothy recognized, the silent communication of people who had discussed this conversation in private, who had rehearsed their responses to anticipated objections. "We all decided together," Vanessa said carefully. "Remember? We had that meeting with Harrison where he explained the portfolio restructuring. You signed all the authorization forms." Dorothy remembered the meeting differently. She remembered being presented with a stack of documents during a lunch that had been positioned as a social visit, being told that the forms were routine paperwork for account updates, being assured that Harrison was simply modernizing her portfolio to optimize returns. She remembered asking questions and being told not to worry about the technical details, that the important thing was that her money would be working harder for her. "I remember being told I was too old to understand the complexities of modern investing," Dorothy said, her voice gaining strength. "I remember being assured that you knew what was best for my money because you understood technology in ways I never could." The kitchen fell silent, except for the familiar morning sounds that had provided the soundtrack to thousands of family discussions in this space. But this silence felt different, charged with the recognition that fundamental assumptions about family hierarchy and decision-making authority were being questioned. Michael set down his coffee mug and moved closer to his mother, his expression shifting from casual confidence to something that looked like genuine concern. "Mom, we never said you were too old to understand anything. We just wanted to help you take advantage of opportunities that maybe weren't on your radar." "Not on my radar," Dorothy repeated, thinking about the months of research she had done before every major financial decision, the way she had educated herself about mutual funds when they were new, the careful attention she had paid to her 401k allocation throughout her working years. "Because 73-year-old women don't understand innovation?" Vanessa stood and moved to the kitchen island, her posture taking on the controlled energy Dorothy recognized from their previous discussions about household management, technology adoption, and lifestyle optimization. "Of course that's not what we meant. But you have to admit, the investment landscape has changed dramatically since you were actively managing your business finances. These new sectors require specialized knowledge." "Specialized knowledge," Dorothy said, unfolding the investment statement again. "Is that what we call it when specialized knowledge loses 37% of someone else's money in 3 months?" The question hung in the morning air between them, highlighting the uncomfortable gap between theoretical expertise and practical results. Dorothy looked at these two people who had somehow assumed authority over her financial future, who had repositioned her from successful business owner to confused elderly person in need of guidance. She thought about Robert, who had possessed an intuitive understanding of respect that had shaped their marriage and their approach to parenting. He never would have tolerated the casual dismissal of someone's experience, even when that experience came from an older generation. He had taught their children that courtesy was not optional, that wisdom could be found in unexpected places, and that confidence without humility was just arrogance waiting to be corrected. Michael cleared his throat, the sound breaking the silence that had stretched uncomfortably long. "Look, Mom, maybe we can schedule another meeting with Harrison. You can ask him directly about the investment strategy, get more clarity on why these particular funds were chosen." "Another meeting where I'm walked through decisions that have already been made?" Dorothy asked. "Another opportunity to have complex financial instruments explained to me in terms simple enough for my aging brain to process?" Vanessa's face flushed slightly, recognizing perhaps for the first time how their well-intentioned guidance might have felt to someone accustomed to making her own decisions. "That's not fair, Mom Williams. We've been trying to help you navigate a complicated financial world. We never intended to make you feel excluded from the process." Dorothy stood slowly, her movements careful but determined. She walked to the kitchen window again, looking out at the neighborhood where she had built her life, raised her children, and established herself as someone whose judgment could be trusted. Mrs. Patterson was still working in her garden, her movements showing the kind of practiced competence that came from decades of experience. The sight strengthened Dorothy's resolve. "Intended or not," she said without turning around, "that's exactly what happened. And now I'm looking at a 37% loss on money I can't afford to lose. Invested in sectors I was told I couldn't understand. Managed by people who somehow convinced my own family that my judgment couldn't be trusted." When she turned back to face them, Michael and Vanessa saw something in her expression that made them both step back slightly. It wasn't anger exactly, but something more unsettling. The quiet determination of someone who had spent 73 years learning how the world worked and was tired of pretending otherwise. "I think," Dorothy said quietly, "it's time I demonstrated exactly how much this old woman understands about protecting her interests." The statement carried a weight that made the kitchen feel smaller, more charged with possibility and consequence. Michael and Vanessa exchanged another look, this one less confident than their earlier silent communications, as they began to realize that their assumptions about Dorothy's capabilities might have been as flawed as their investment strategy. Outside the kitchen window, the neighborhood continued its morning routine, but inside the house on Elmwood Drive, three adults were beginning a conversation that would test whether respect could be rebuilt between generations, whether trust could survive the collision between good intentions and devastating results, and whether a 73-year-old woman could reclaim control of a life that others had decided she was too old to manage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The tension from that morning's kitchen confrontation lingered throughout the day, like smoke from a poorly ventilated fire. Dorothy spent the afternoon in her home office, the small bedroom that had once belonged to her youngest daughter Sarah, surrounded by filing cabinets that contained 40 years of meticulous financial records. Each folder was labeled in her careful handwriting, organized by year and category, with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was protection. She pulled the Hartwell and Associates folder, which had grown surprisingly thick in just 3 months. The paperwork told a story she was only beginning to understand. Authorization forms for portfolio restructuring, risk assessment questionnaires that had somehow classified her as an aggressive growth investor, despite her explicitly stated preference for conservative strategies, and monthly statements showing a steady erosion of assets that had taken decades to accumulate. The phone rang, interrupting her investigation. Sarah's voice carried the warm familiarity of their weekly Tuesday call, a tradition they had maintained since Sarah moved to Portland 5 years ago to pursue her career as a pediatric nurse. "Hi, Mom, how are things going with the household integration project?" Sarah asked, using the euphemistic term Michael had coined to describe his and Vanessa's move into Dorothy's home. "Michael mentioned they're helping you modernize your investment approach." Dorothy paused, considering how much to share. Sarah had always been the most perceptive of her children, the one who inherited Robert's ability to read between the lines of family conversations. "They've certainly modernized something," Dorothy said carefully, "though I'm not sure I'd call it helping." "What do you mean?" Sarah's tone shifted, carrying the alert attention of someone who had learned to recognize when their mother was choosing words diplomatically. Dorothy found herself recounting the morning's discovery, the investment losses, the casual dismissal of her concerns about risk tolerance and time horizons. As she spoke, she could hear Sarah's breathing change, the professional calm of someone accustomed to managing crises taking over. "Mom," Sarah said when Dorothy finished, "that doesn't sound like modernization. That sounds like someone gambling with your retirement security without your informed consent." The validation felt like cool water on burned skin. For the first time since opening that investment statement, Dorothy felt her perception of reality confirmed by someone whose judgment she trusted. "Your brother and Vanessa seem to think I'm overreacting," she said. "They keep talking about long-term thinking and modern investment strategies." "I'm sure they do," Sarah said, her voice carrying an edge that Dorothy hadn't heard since Sarah was 16, and defending her younger siblings from perceived injustices. "But Mom, you built a successful business from nothing. You managed complex vendor relationships, seasonal cash flow, regulatory compliance for food service. You understand risk management better than most people. The idea that you suddenly can't comprehend investment principles is insulting." Dorothy felt tears she hadn't expected threatening to spill over. The months of being treated like someone whose mental acuity was declining had begun to make her question her own perceptions. Sarah's fierce defense of her competence felt like coming home after being lost in unfamiliar territory. "There's something else," Dorothy said, her voice dropping to the tone she had once used to share serious concerns about the children with Robert. "I think this is part of a larger pattern. They've been making decisions about my life, small ones at first, but increasingly significant ones, without really consulting me." She told Sarah about the gradual changes. The new internet provider that cost twice as much but offered, quote, essential security features. The home insurance policy that had been switched to a more expensive carrier that specialized in protecting senior homeowners. The monthly grocery delivery service that had replaced her weekly shopping trips because driving wasn't safe for someone her age. Each change had been presented as an improvement, a modernization, a protective measure designed with her best interests in mind. But the cumulative effect was that Dorothy found herself increasingly isolated from the practical details of managing her own life, dependent on her son and daughter-in-law for information and access to services she had previously managed herself. "They canceled your driving?" Sarah's voice carried the sharp disbelief of someone hearing information that didn't match her understanding of her mother's capabilities. "Not canceled exactly," Dorothy clarified. "But they've made it clear they think it's dangerous for someone my age to be driving to unfamiliar places, dealing with traffic, managing errands that could be handled more efficiently through delivery services. Mom, you've been driving for 57 years without a major accident. You renewed your license last year and passed both the vision and written tests with perfect scores. What's changed, except their perception of your capabilities?" The question hung between them, highlighting the uncomfortable reality that Dorothy's supposed decline in competence corresponded precisely with Michael and Vanessa's increased involvement in her daily life. She had become less capable in direct proportion to their assumption of greater responsibility for her affairs. "I've been thinking about that," Dorothy said, moving to the window where she could see Mrs. Patterson still working in her garden despite the afternoon heat. "I think I've been so focused on not wanting to burden them, on being grateful for their help, that I've allowed them to gradually take over decisions that I'm perfectly capable of making myself." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Dorothy could almost hear her processing the implications. "Mom, can I ask you something directly? Do you think they're deliberately taking advantage of you, or do you think they genuinely believe they're helping?" It was the question Dorothy had been avoiding, the one that touched on the fundamental nature of trust within families. She thought about Michael as a child, his earnest desire to fix problems and protect people he cared about. She remembered Vanessa's early days in the family, her genuine efforts to connect and contribute. But she also thought about the casual certainty with which they had dismissed her concerns, the way they spoke about her in her presence, as if she weren't quite fully there. "I think," Dorothy said slowly, "they've convinced themselves that helping me means managing me. I think they genuinely believe that because they understand technology and modern business practices, they're more qualified to make decisions about my life than I am. But I also think that believing something doesn't make it right, especially when it's costing me my independence and my financial security." After hanging up with Sarah, Dorothy returned to her investigation of the Hartwell and Associates paperwork. She spread the documents across her desk like pieces of a puzzle, looking for patterns that might explain how her conservative investment philosophy had been transformed into high-risk speculation without her knowledge or consent. The authorization forms contained language that seemed deliberately obscure, phrases like discretionary portfolio management and dynamic asset allocation that sounded professional but apparently gave the investment firm broad latitude to make dramatic changes without specific client approval. The risk assessment questionnaire had been filled out in handwriting she didn't recognize, with responses that directly contradicted her stated preferences. Most troubling was a series of email exchanges between Vanessa and Harrison Webb, the Hartwell advisor, discussing Dorothy's, quote, cognitive limitations and the need to simplify the investment approach while simultaneously pursuing, quote, aggressive growth strategies appropriate for younger investors. The email suggested that Vanessa had positioned herself as Dorothy's de facto financial guardian, someone authorized to make decisions on behalf of a client who supposedly lacked the capacity to understand complex financial instruments. The manipulation was subtle but systematic. Dorothy had been characterized as someone whose age made her inherently incapable of understanding modern investment strategies, while simultaneously being committed to investments that required sophisticated risk tolerance and long-term thinking. She had been infantilized and exploited in the same document. Dorothy printed the emails and added them to her growing file of evidence. The pattern was becoming clear. Her son and daughter-in-law had gradually assumed control of her affairs by positioning her as someone whose judgment could no longer be trusted, then used that assumed authority to make decisions that benefited their vision of optimal outcomes rather than her stated preferences. The irony was sharp enough to cut. In their effort to protect her from making poor decisions, they had made catastrophically poor decisions on her behalf. In their certainty that they understood modern finance better than she did, they had gambled away more money in 3 months than Dorothy had ever lost in 40 years of business ownership. That evening, Michael and Vanessa returned from their day of managing their startup, a social media platform designed to help seniors navigate technology, carrying the energetic optimism of people who believed they were changing the world for the better. They found Dorothy in the living room, reading a financial magazine with the kind of focused attention that suggested serious research rather than casual browsing. "Mom, you don't need to stress yourself about investment analysis," Vanessa said, settling onto the couch with the graceful confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "That's exactly why we connected you with Harrison. He handles all the complex research, so you can focus on enjoying your retirement." Dorothy looked up from her magazine, studying Vanessa's face with the careful attention she had once reserved for reading potential catering clients. "Enjoying retirement," she repeated. "Is that what we call watching 37% of your life savings disappear in 3 months?" Michael sat down across from his mother, his expression shifting into the patient mode Dorothy was beginning to recognize as his default when addressing her concerns. "Mom, we've talked about this. Short-term volatility is normal with growth investments. You can't evaluate performance based on quarterly results." "I can evaluate performance based on whether my investment strategy matches my stated risk tolerance and time horizon," Dorothy replied. "And according to the documentation I've been reviewing, neither my risk tolerance nor my time horizon was accurately represented to your friend Harrison." Vanessa's face showed the first flicker of uncertainty Dorothy had seen since the morning's confrontation. "What documentation?" "Harrison explained everything in detail during our meeting." Dorothy reached for the folder she had prepared, extracting the risk assessment questionnaire with its forged responses. "This documentation. The one where someone indicated that a 73-year-old woman with a 20-year retirement timeline was comfortable with aggressive growth strategies and had extensive experience with alternative investments." She held up the form, pointing to handwriting that clearly wasn't hers. "This documentation that suggests I requested maximum risk exposure for maximum return potential, when I specifically told Harrison that my priority was capital preservation with modest growth." Michael and Vanessa exchanged the look Dorothy was learning to recognize, the silent communication of people who had been caught in an inconsistency but were still working to control the narrative. "Harrison probably made some adjustments based on industry best practices," Michael said carefully. "Investment advisors have sophisticated models for optimizing portfolios that might not match exactly what clients think they want." "What clients think they want," Dorothy said, her voice gaining strength. "That's an interesting way to describe respecting someone's explicitly stated investment preferences." She pulled out the printed emails between Vanessa and Harrison, the ones discussing her supposed cognitive limitations. "And this is an interesting way to describe collaboration and consultation." Vanessa's face went pale as she recognized her own words on paper. The casual dismissal of Dorothy's mental acuity that had seemed reasonable in private correspondence but looked starkly offensive when presented as evidence of deliberate manipulation. "Mom Williams, that's not what those emails mean," Vanessa said quickly. "Harrison asked about your comfort level with complex financial concepts, and I was just explaining that you preferred simplified explanations." "Simplified explanations," Dorothy said, reading from one of the emails. "Or, as you put it here, Dorothy has difficulty understanding modern investment concepts and needs someone to make decisions in her best interest without overwhelming her with technical details." The living room fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock Robert had inherited from his father, a sound that had marked time through decades of family conversations, but had never before measured the weight of deliberate deception. Michael looked stricken, as if seeing his mother's situation from an outside perspective for the first time. "Mom, I think there might have been some miscommunication about your level of involvement in the investment decisions." "Miscommunication," Dorothy repeated, considering the word. "Is that what we call it when someone's financial autonomy is systematically undermined by people who claim to be protecting their interests?" She stood slowly, her movements deliberate as she gathered the scattered documents. "I think what we have here isn't miscommunication. I think what we have here is a fundamental disagreement about whether a 73-year-old woman is capable of making informed decisions about her own money." Vanessa started to speak, but Dorothy held up her hand with the quiet authority of someone who had managed difficult clients and employee conflicts for decades. "Tomorrow," Dorothy said, "I'm going to demonstrate exactly how capable I am of protecting my own interests. Tonight, I suggest you both think very carefully about whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem." She left them sitting in the living room, surrounded by evidence of their misguided paternalism, and climbed the stairs to her bedroom with the steady determination of someone who had finally decided to stop being managed and start managing. Outside her bedroom window, the neighborhood settled into evening quiet, but inside the house on Elmwood Drive, 3 adults were beginning to understand that assumptions about age and competence could be as dangerous as any high-risk investment and considerably more expensive to correct. Dorothy woke Thursday morning with the crystalline clarity that comes after a night of profound decision-making. She had spent hours staring at the ceiling, not from anxiety but from the methodical planning that had always preceded her most important business moves. By dawn, she had a strategy that would have impressed the venture capitalists who had dismissed her understanding of modern business practices. Her first call was to Janet Morrison, her accountant for the past 15 years. Janet had helped Dorothy navigate the complexities of small business taxation, retirement planning, and the eventual sale of Sunrise Catering. More importantly, Janet had never once suggested that Dorothy's age affected her ability to understand financial concepts. "Dorothy, good to hear from you." Janet's voice carried the warmth of professional friendship built over years of quarterly meetings and tax season stress. "How's the family integration going? Michael mentioned they were helping you optimize your investment portfolio." "That's actually why I'm calling," Dorothy said, settling into her home office chair with the Hartwell folder spread before her. "I need your professional opinion on some investment decisions that were apparently made on my behalf." She walked Janet through the portfolio restructuring, the risk assessment discrepancies, and the email communications she had discovered. Janet's responses grew increasingly sharp as the scope of the situation became clear. "Dorothy, this is seriously concerning," Janet said after reviewing the electronic copies Dorothy had sent during their call. "The risk profile changes alone constitute a fundamental breach of fiduciary duty. But the bigger issue is the apparent misrepresentation of your mental competency to authorize these changes." "So I'm not overreacting to a normal portfolio adjustment?" "Overreacting?" Janet's laugh carried no humor. "Dorothy, in 15 years of working with you, I've watched you analyze complex depreciation schedules, negotiate multi-year vendor contracts, and restructure business debt during the 2008 recession. The idea that you suddenly can't understand investment principles is not just wrong, it's actionable." The word actionable hung in the air with the weight of legal possibility. Dorothy had been thinking in terms of family conflict and personal betrayal, but Janet was suggesting that what had happened might constitute actual financial fraud. "What kind of action are we talking about?" Dorothy asked. "The kind that requires a lawyer who specializes in elder financial abuse," Janet said without hesitation. "What you're describing fits the pattern of financial exploitation that's unfortunately common when family members assume control of an older person's assets. The good news is that Illinois has strong protections for seniors in these situations." After ending the call with Janet, Dorothy sat quietly in her office, absorbing the shift from family disappointment to potential legal remedy. The word abuse felt strange when applied to her own situation. She thought of Michael and Vanessa as misguided rather than malicious, but the financial impact was undeniable regardless of their intentions. Her second call was to Rebecca Chen, the estate planning attorney who had helped her update her will after Robert's death. Rebecca had impressed Dorothy with her direct communication style and her refusal to oversimplify complex legal concepts for older clients. "Mrs. Williams, what can I do for you today?" Rebecca's voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone managing a busy practice while maintaining personal attention to each client. Dorothy explained her situation with the clinical precision she had once used to describe catering logistics to potential clients. Rebecca listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated both legal expertise and genuine concern. "Mrs. Williams," Rebecca said when Dorothy finished, "what you're describing involves several potential legal violations: securities fraud, elder financial abuse, possible forgery of legal documents, and breach of fiduciary duty. This isn't a family dispute that requires mediation. This is a criminal matter that requires immediate legal intervention." The clinical assessment sent a chill through Dorothy's carefully maintained composure. She had been thinking in terms of hurt feelings and family dynamics, but Rebecca was describing activities that could result in criminal charges against her own son and daughter-in-law. "I don't want to destroy my family," Dorothy said quietly. "I just want my financial autonomy restored and my losses recovered." "I understand that," Rebecca said with the gentle firmness Dorothy remembered from their previous interactions. "But Mrs. Williams, the people who did this to you counted on exactly that sentiment. They assumed that your love for your family would prevent you from protecting yourself. That assumption enabled their behavior." Rebecca recommended a colleague who specialized in financial crimes against seniors, Marcus Rodriguez, with the firm of Rodriguez, Chang and Associates. "Marcus has extensive experience with family-perpetrated financial abuse," she explained. "He understands how to pursue legal remedies while preserving family relationships when possible, but he also won't let emotional considerations prevent him from protecting his clients' interests." Dorothy scheduled a consultation for that afternoon, then spent the morning organizing her evidence with the systematic thoroughness that had made her catering business legendary for its attention to detail. She created a timeline of decisions, a summary of financial losses, and a collection of documents that demonstrated the pattern of deception. The law offices of Rodriguez, Chang and Associates occupied the 10th floor of a downtown building that Dorothy remembered from her business days. The reception area spoke to success without ostentation, quality furniture, professional artwork, and the kind of organized efficiency that suggested competent management of complex cases. Marcus Rodriguez was younger than Dorothy had expected, perhaps 45, with the kind of focused energy that reminded her of her most successful catering clients. He listened to her story without the patronizing patience she had grown to expect from younger professionals, asking sharp questions that demonstrated both legal acuity and respect for her intelligence. "Mrs. Williams," he said after reviewing her documentation, "you've done excellent work assembling this evidence. Most clients come to me with emotional complaints but limited documentation. You've presented a clear pattern of financial exploitation with paper trail evidence that would be compelling in court." Dorothy climbed the stairs to her bedroom, where she would spend the evening reviewing Marcus's retainer agreement and preparing for conversations that would either restore her family's respect for her autonomy or demonstrate that some relationships couldn't survive the collision between good intentions and fundamental disrespect. The house settled into evening quiet around her, but for the first time in months, Dorothy felt like she was finally home in her own life again. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Dorothy's door. Harrison Webb from Hartwell & Associates stood on her front porch at 8:30 a.m., his expensive suit slightly wrinkled and his usually confident demeanor noticeably strained. He carried a leather briefcase and the nervous energy of someone who had received an unwelcome phone call. "Mrs. Williams," he said when Dorothy opened the door, "I was hoping we could have a conversation about your recent concerns regarding your investment portfolio." Dorothy studied his face, noting the careful rehearsal behind his casual tone. Someone had alerted Harrison that his elderly client was asking uncomfortable questions, and he had arrived to manage the situation before it escalated beyond his control. "Of course," Dorothy said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I always have time to discuss my financial affairs with the person managing them." She led him to the living room, where the morning light illuminated the coffee table she had prepared with her organized documentation. Harrison's eyes widened slightly as he noticed the neat stacks of papers, the printed emails, and the legal pad covered with Dorothy's careful handwriting. Mrs. Williams, Harrison began, settling into the chair across from her with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing difficult client conversations. I understand there may have been some confusion about the recent adjustments to your portfolio strategy. Confusion? Dorothy repeated, reaching for the risk assessment questionnaire with its forged responses. Is that what we're calling unauthorized changes to investment objectives, based on falsified client preferences? Harrison's composure flickered as he recognized the document. I think there may have been some miscommunication during our initial consultation. Sometimes clients indicate preferences that don't align with optimal portfolio construction for their specific situation. Optimal for whom? Dorothy asked, her voice carrying the sharp precision she had once used to negotiate vendor contracts. Because a 37% loss in 3 months doesn't seem optimal for a 73-year-old woman with conservative risk tolerance and limited time horizon. Mrs. Williams, market volatility is temporary. These technology investments are positioned for significant long-term growth that will more than compensate for short-term fluctuations. Dorothy opened her legal pad to a page filled with research notes. According to my analysis of these technology funds, 60% of their holdings are in companies that have never shown a profit, 40% are in sectors that didn't exist 5 years ago, and 20% are in what financial analysts call speculative moonshots. Does that sound like appropriate investment strategy for someone my age? Harrison shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that the elderly woman he had been told couldn't understand complex financial concepts was demonstrating more sophisticated investment knowledge than many of his younger clients. Mrs. Williams, I want to assure you that all portfolio adjustments were made in accordance with the authorization forms you signed and the risk tolerance assessment you completed. Dorothy pulled out the printed emails between Harrison and Vanessa, placing them on the coffee table where he could see his own words. These authorizations that discussed my supposed cognitive limitations and need for simplified decision-making? Harrison's face went pale as he read his own casual dismissal of Dorothy's mental acuity. The professional language that had seemed reasonable when discussing an elderly client in private, but looked starkly inappropriate when presented as evidence of age discrimination. Mrs. Williams, those communications were taken out of context. Your daughter-in-law was simply explaining your communication preferences. My communication preferences, Dorothy said, reading from one of the emails, or, as you put it here, client exhibits typical age-related decline in analytical thinking and should not be burdened with complex portfolio decisions. The living room fell silent, except for the tick of Robert's grandfather clock, measuring the weight of words that could no longer be explained away or contextualized into acceptability. I think, Dorothy said quietly, we should discuss how you plan to remediate this situation before it becomes a regulatory matter. Harrison's professional training kicked in, his voice taking on the soothing tone financial advisors used with agitated clients. Mrs. Williams, I'm sure we can address any concerns you have about portfolio performance. Perhaps we could schedule a comprehensive review meeting with your family members present to ensure everyone understands the long-term strategy. Another meeting where my competence is managed by people who apparently understand my interests better than I do? Dorothy asked. I don't think so, Mr. Webb. She reached into her briefcase, Robert's old leather case that she had brought up from storage for this occasion, and withdrew Marcus Rodriguez's business card. My attorney will be contacting you this afternoon with specific remediation requirements, she said, placing the card on the coffee table between them. You have 1 week to reverse the unauthorized portfolio changes, restore my original conservative allocation, and compensate me for losses incurred due to investments that violated my stated risk tolerance. Harrison stared at the attorney's card, as if it were evidence of personal betrayal. Mrs. Williams, there's no need to involve lawyers in what could be resolved through professional communication. I'm sure we can find a mutually acceptable solution. We could have found a mutually acceptable solution if you had respected my investment objectives in the first place, Dorothy replied. But since you chose to base investment decisions on assumptions about my mental limitations rather than my explicitly stated preferences, we'll resolve this through legal channels. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced that Michael and Vanessa were beginning their day. Dorothy heard Vanessa's voice call out, Harrison? What are you doing here so early? Harrison looked trapped between the elderly client who was proving far more formidable than expected and the family members who had enabled his condescending approach to her financial management. Vanessa appeared in the living room doorway, her morning routine disrupted by the unexpected visit. She wore silk pajamas that cost more than Dorothy's monthly utility bill, her hair styled even at this early hour with the kind of maintenance that spoke to unlimited time and resources. "Harrison came by to discuss some concerns about my investment portfolio," Dorothy said before he could speak. "Apparently, my questions about unauthorized risk exposure triggered some anxiety at Hartwell and Associates." Michael joined them, coffee cup in hand, his expression shifting from casual morning greeting to alert concern as he recognized the tension in the room. "What kind of concerns?" Michael asked, looking between his mother and the financial advisor who was supposed to be simplifying her life rather than complicating it. Dorothy gestured to the documents spread across the coffee table. "The kind of concerns that arise when someone discovers their conservative investment strategy has been replaced with high-risk speculation, without their knowledge or consent." She handed Michael the risk assessment questionnaire with its forged responses. "The kind of concerns that develop when someone realizes their family has been characterizing them as mentally incompetent to justify financial decisions that violate their stated preferences." Michael read the document, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror as he understood the implications of what he was seeing. "Mom, this handwriting isn't yours," he said quietly. "No, it isn't," Dorothy replied, which raises interesting questions about how Harrison came to believe that I had requested maximum risk exposure for my retirement funds. Vanessa moved closer to read over Michael's shoulder, her face showing the first genuine alarm Dorothy had seen since this crisis began. "Harrison, what is this? Why does this form show responses that Dorothy never gave?" Harrison's professional composure finally cracked under the weight of being confronted with evidence of his own malfeasance. "There was some confusion during the initial assessment. Sometimes we need to interpret client responses based on industry best practices and optimal allocation models." "Interpret client responses," Michael said, his voice carrying the dawning realization of someone understanding they had been complicit in something much worse than poor communication. "You mean fabricate client responses to justify investment decisions that serve your commission structure rather than her interests." The accusation hung in the morning air like smoke from an electrical fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Harrison stood abruptly, gathering his briefcase with the nervous energy of someone whose carefully constructed professional reputation was collapsing in real time. "I think we should schedule a formal meeting to address these concerns through proper channels," he said, moving toward the door with the hasty retreat of someone who had seriously underestimated his opposition. "You'll be hearing from my attorney this afternoon," Dorothy called after him. "1 week, Mr. Webb. 1 week to make this right before it becomes a regulatory investigation." After Harrison left, the 3 family members sat in silence among the scattered evidence of systematic financial manipulation. The morning light that had seemed golden an hour earlier now felt harsh, illuminating uncomfortable truths that could no longer be avoided or rationalized. "Mom," Michael said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone recognizing their own culpability, "I think we need to talk about what's been happening here." "Yes," Dorothy agreed. "I think we do. But first, I want you both to understand something important. I hired an attorney yesterday, a very good attorney who specializes in elder financial abuse. What's been done to me has a name, and it's not just morally wrong, it's criminal." Vanessa sank into the chair Harrison had vacated, her face showing the first genuine vulnerability Dorothy had seen since she'd known her. "Mom Williams, we never intended for any of this to happen. We thought we were helping you navigate a complex financial landscape. By lying about my mental competence to justify investment decisions I never authorized?" Dorothy asked. "By forging documents to create the appearance of consent I never gave? By dismissing my concerns as the confused complaints of someone too old to understand modern finance?" Michael set down his coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. "Mom, I think we've made some serious mistakes. I think we've been so focused on trying to help that we stopped listening to what you actually wanted." "Stopped listening," Dorothy repeated. "Or stopped believing that what I wanted mattered as much as what you thought was best for me." The question forced them to confront the fundamental assumption that had enabled their behavior, the belief that Dorothy's age made her inherently less capable of making good decisions about her own life than they were. "What happens now?" Vanessa asked quietly. Dorothy looked at these 2 people who had systematically undermined her autonomy while convincing themselves they were protecting her interests. She thought about Marcus Rodriguez's advice, about the legal remedies available to her, about the choice between family preservation and personal protection. Now, she said, you have 1 week to prove that you understand the difference between helping someone and controlling them. 1 week to demonstrate that you respect my right to make decisions about my own money, my own life, my own future. She stood, gathering the documents that represented both her evidence and her empowerment. Because if you can't prove that, you're going to discover that this elderly woman understands exactly how to protect herself from people who claim to love her while treating her like she's incompetent. The ultimatum settled over the living room like dust after an explosion, marking the end of one version of their family dynamic and the beginning of something that would either be built on genuine respect or not built at all. The weekend passed in an atmosphere of careful politeness that felt more foreign than open hostility. Michael and Vanessa moved through the house like visitors who had overstayed their welcome, their earlier confidence replaced by the nervous energy of people who had finally understood the magnitude of their miscalculation. Saturday morning found Dorothy in her garden, tending to the tomato plants Robert had helped her establish 15 years earlier. The physical work provided a welcome contrast to the mental exhaustion of the past week, her hands finding familiar comfort in soil that responded predictably to care and attention. She heard the screen door close and looked up to see Michael approaching with 2 cups of coffee, his face carrying the hesitant expression of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, settling onto the garden bench his father had built during his retirement years. Dorothy accepted the coffee, noting that he had prepared it exactly as she preferred, strong, with a splash of real cream rather than the artificial substitutes Vanessa usually provided. Small gestures, but ones that suggested attention to her preferences rather than assumptions about what was best for her. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Michael began, his voice carrying the careful quality of someone who had spent hours rehearsing. "About the difference between helping and controlling. I think I've been confusing the two for longer than I want to admit." Dorothy continued working the soil around her tomato plants, allowing him space to find his words without the pressure of direct eye contact. "When Dad died, I felt this enormous responsibility to protect you," Michael continued. "You seemed so overwhelmed by all the financial decisions, the insurance paperwork, the business sale negotiations. I wanted to make things easier for you." "Making things easier for me," Dorothy said quietly, "or making yourself feel less anxious about my ability to handle them?" The question hit its target with surgical precision. Michael set down his coffee cup and stared at his hands, recognizing perhaps for the first time the self-serving nature of his protective instincts. "Both, I think," he admitted. "But Mom, somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as someone who was temporarily overwhelmed by grief and started seeing you as someone who needed permanent protection from complexity." Dorothy paused in her gardening, struck by the honesty of his self-assessment. It was the first time since this crisis began that Michael had acknowledged her competence rather than defending his management of her affairs. "And Vanessa?" Dorothy asked. Michael's expression grew more complicated. "Vanessa never knew you before Dad died. She's only seen you during the hardest period of your life, when you were struggling with decisions you'd never had to make alone. I think she formed her impression of your capabilities based on that version of you, not the woman who built a successful business and managed our family's finances for 40 years. So she's been trying to help someone who doesn't actually exist," Dorothy observed. "Yes," Michael said simply. "And I've been enabling that by not correcting her assumptions about your abilities." They sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of Dorothy's continued competence. The thriving garden she had planned and maintained, the well-kept property that showed no signs of neglect, the organized efficiency that characterized every aspect of her daily life. "What do you want from us now?" Michael asked finally. Dorothy considered the question that would determine whether their family could survive this crisis, or whether some damage was simply too fundamental to repair. "I want what I've always wanted," she said. "I want to be treated like a competent adult whose opinions matter, whose preferences are respected, and whose experience has value. I want to be consulted about decisions that affect my life, rather than managed by people who think they know what's best for me." "Even when we disagree with your choices?" "Especially then," Dorothy replied firmly. "Because the right to make mistakes is part of what makes someone an autonomous adult. Taking away that right doesn't protect people, it diminishes them." Michael nodded slowly, beginning to understand the philosophical difference between protective care and respectful support. Mom, if we can fix this, the investment mess, the legal issues, everything, what would that look like going forward? Dorothy stood, brushing soil from her gardening gloves, with the methodical precision that characterized all her movements. It would look like you and Vanessa, living here as grateful adults who contribute to household decisions rather than making them unilaterally. It would look like my money being invested according to my risk tolerance, not your theories about optimal growth. It would look like family meetings where everyone's voice carries equal weight, regardless of age. And if we can't prove we can do that? Dorothy met his eyes directly, her expression carrying the quiet determination that had sustained her through decades of challenges. Then you'll discover that your mother understands exactly how to protect herself, even from people she loves. That afternoon, Vanessa found Dorothy in her home office, reviewing financial statements with the focused attention of someone conducting a comprehensive audit. She knocked softly on the doorframe, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like genuine uncertainty. "Mom Williams, could I speak with you privately?" Dorothy gestured to the chair across from her desk, the same chair where she had conducted interviews for catering staff and reviewed vendor contracts during her business years. "I owe you an apology," Vanessa began, her voice lacking its usual corporate polish, "not just for the investment decisions, but for how I've treated you since we moved in here." She paused, struggling with words that clearly weren't coming easily. "I've been acting like you were my client rather than my family. Like you were someone whose life needed to be optimized rather than someone whose wisdom I should have been learning from." Dorothy set aside her financial statements, giving Vanessa her full attention for what felt like the first time in months. "What changed your perspective?" Dorothy asked. "Harrison's visit yesterday," Vanessa admitted. "Watching him try to manipulate you, seeing how easily he dismissed your intelligence. I realized that's exactly what I've been doing. Maybe with better intentions, but with the same fundamental disrespect for your capabilities." Vanessa reached into her purse and withdrew a thick folder. "I spent yesterday going through all the changes we've made to your accounts, your services, your daily routines. Everything we justified as helping you manage complexity." She placed the folder on Dorothy's desk. "I want to reverse all of it, every single thing we changed, without really consulting you." Dorothy opened the folder to find detailed lists of account changes, service modifications, and routine alterations that Vanessa had documented with the same thoroughness she had once applied to venture capital due diligence. "This is impressive work," Dorothy said, recognizing the hours of research and analysis the documentation represented. "It's also horrifying work," Vanessa replied. "Looking at it all together, I can see how we systematically stripped away your autonomy while convincing ourselves we were being helpful." They sat quietly while Dorothy reviewed the comprehensive record of decisions that had gradually transformed her from independent homeowner to managed dependent. "Vanessa," Dorothy said finally, "why did you assume I needed this level of management?" Vanessa's face showed the discomfort of someone confronting their own prejudices. "Because you're 73, and I've been conditioned to think that means diminished capacity. Because you occasionally asked for help understanding new technology, and I interpreted that as general incompetence rather than specific learning needs." She paused, her voice growing stronger as she found her footing in uncomfortable honesty. "And because managing things made me feel useful and important during a time when my own career felt stalled and uncertain. I think I needed to feel needed, even if that meant creating needs that didn't actually exist." The admission hung between them, raw and honest in a way that their previous conversations had never achieved. "What do you want to happen now?" Dorothy asked. "I want to earn back your trust," Vanessa said simply. "I want to prove that I can be helpful without being controlling, that I can respect your autonomy while still being part of your family." Dorothy studied her daughter-in-law's face, seeing vulnerability that had been hidden beneath months of professional competence and well-intentioned management. "That will require fundamental changes in how you see me and how we interact," Dorothy said. "It will mean accepting that my age brings wisdom as well as limitations, that my experience has value even when it doesn't align with current trends." "I understand that now," Vanessa said. "And Mom Williams, I want you to know, if you decide to pursue legal action against Harrison, against us, against anyone involved in this mess. I'll support whatever decision you make, even if it means consequences for Michael and me." Dorothy felt something shift in her perception of Vanessa, a recognition that beneath the misguided paternalism lay someone capable of genuine growth and authentic respect. "We'll see," Dorothy said. "Right now, I'm more interested in whether this family can learn from its mistakes than in punishing anyone for making them." As Vanessa left her office, Dorothy returned to her financial statements with a sense that healing might actually be possible if everyone involved was willing to do the difficult work of building new relationships based on mutual respect rather than protective assumptions. Outside her window, the neighborhood was settling into Sunday evening quiet, but inside the house on Elmwood Drive, 3 adults were beginning the delicate process of rebuilding trust that had been systematically eroded by good intentions and devastating assumptions about the relationship between age and competence. Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call that would expand Dorothy's understanding of just how widespread the problem had become. Dr. Patricia Henley, Dorothy's physician for the past 12 years, called with what she described as, quote, "some concerning information that had come to her attention over the weekend." "Dorothy, I received a very unusual request last Friday," Dr. Henley said, her voice carrying the careful tone medical professionals used when discussing sensitive matters. "Someone called claiming to be your daughter-in-law, requesting copies of your medical records and asking about cognitive assessment protocols." Dorothy felt her stomach tighten as another piece of the manipulation puzzle clicked into place. What kind of cognitive assessment protocols? The caller wanted to know about procedures for documenting age-related mental decline, specifically for legal purposes involving financial decision-making capacity. She claimed you had been showing signs of confusion and that the family was concerned about your ability to manage your affairs safely. The calculated nature of the inquiry sent a chill through Dorothy's carefully maintained composure. This wasn't misguided paternalism or well-intentioned overprotection. This was systematic preparation for a competency challenge that would have stripped away her legal right to control her own life. "Dr. Henley, have you observed any signs of cognitive decline during my regular appointments?" "Dorothy, your cognitive function has been consistently strong throughout our 12-year relationship. Your blood pressure is well controlled, your cholesterol levels are excellent, and your mental acuity during our discussions about treatment options has always impressed me." I told the caller that I had no medical basis for concerns about your decision-making capacity. Dorothy sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, absorbing the implications of what she was learning. While she had been focused on investment fraud and financial manipulation, her family had apparently been building a case for legal incompetency that would have given them complete control over her assets and her life. "What happened after you declined to provide the records?" Dorothy asked. The caller became quite insistent, claiming that family members had observed concerning behaviors at home that might not be apparent during brief medical appointments. She suggested that I might be missing early signs of dementia because I wasn't looking for them carefully enough. The arrogance of the suggestion, that a trained physician with 12 years of patient history couldn't recognize cognitive decline, revealed the depth of Vanessa's certainty about Dorothy's supposed limitations. "I informed the caller that medical records are confidential, and that any concerns about a patient's cognitive function would need to be discussed directly with the patient present," Dr. Henley continued. "But Dorothy, I wanted you to know about this conversation because it suggests someone is building documentation for a competency proceeding." After hanging up with Dr. Henley, Dorothy immediately called Marcus Rodriguez to report this new development. His response was swift and sharp. "Mrs. Williams, this changes everything," Marcus said, his voice carrying the focused intensity of someone recognizing escalated criminal behavior. "Attempting to obtain medical records under false pretenses for the purpose of building a competency case constitutes medical fraud and potential elder abuse conspiracy." He explained that the pattern of behavior, financial manipulation combined with attempted medical documentation of incompetency, suggested a coordinated effort to assume complete control over Dorothy's legal and financial autonomy. "This isn't family members making poor decisions," Marcus said bluntly. "This is systematic preparation for a guardianship proceeding that would have stripped you of all decision-making rights." The legal terminology hit Dorothy like cold water. Guardianship meant court-ordered supervision of every aspect of her life: from where she lived, to how she spent her money, to what medical treatments she could receive. It was legal death while still breathing. "What do we do now?" Dorothy asked. "Now we document everything and prepare for full legal warfare," Marcus replied. "Because Mrs. Williams, what they were planning to do to you is not just criminal, it's evil." That afternoon, Dorothy found herself in an uncomfortable but necessary conversation with her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had been tending her roses when Dorothy approached the fence between their properties. "Helen, I need to ask you something that might sound strange," Dorothy began. "Has anyone contacted you recently asking questions about my behavior or mental state?" Mrs. Patterson's gardening shears paused mid-cut as she turned to study Dorothy's face with the sharp attention of someone sensing important subtext. "As a matter of fact, yes," Helen said slowly. "That pretty daughter-in-law of yours stopped by last week. Asked if I'd noticed any concerning changes in your routine, whether you seemed confused or forgetful when we talked over the fence." Dorothy felt her anger building with crystalline clarity. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that you were the sharpest person on this block and that anyone who thought otherwise wasn't paying attention," Helen said with some heat. "I also told her it was odd that family members were asking neighbors about your mental state instead of talking to you directly." Helen set down her gardening tools and faced Dorothy fully. "Dorothy, is everything all right?" Because that conversation felt like someone was fishing for ammunition rather than expressing genuine concern. Dorothy found herself explaining the investment fraud, the attempted medical records request, and the growing evidence of a coordinated effort to establish her incompetency. Helen's face grew increasingly grim as the scope of the manipulation became clear. "My God, Dorothy," Helen said when the story was complete. "They were building a case to have you declared incompetent so they could take control of everything you own." "It appears so," Dorothy said quietly. Helen's expression shifted to the righteous anger of someone who had lived through the Great Depression and World War II and recognized predatory behavior when she saw it. "What kind of people do that to their own family?" Helen demanded. "What kind of children plan to steal their mother's autonomy and call it protection?" The harsh assessment echoed Dorothy's own growing realization that good intentions could no longer explain or excuse the systematic nature of what had been done to her. "Helen, I may need character witnesses if this goes to court," Dorothy said. "People who can testify about my mental competence and decision-making abilities." "You'll have them," Helen said firmly. "Every neighbor on this block knows you're as sharp as you ever were. We've watched you manage your property, maintain your garden, handle contractors, navigate your business sale. Nobody here would believe claims about your incompetency." That evening, Dorothy sat in her home office reviewing the expanding file of evidence that Marcus was assembling. The pattern was now undeniable. Systematic financial fraud, attempted medical documentation fraud, and community reconnaissance aimed at building a competency case that would have given Michael and Vanessa complete control over her life. She thought about the conversation with Helen, about Dr. Henley's phone call, about the months of gradual isolation from her own decision-making processes. What she had initially interpreted as overprotective concern was now revealed as careful preparation for legal theft disguised as family care. The phone rang, interrupting her dark thoughts. Sarah's voice carried the excitement of someone who had been waiting for news. "Mom, I've been doing some research on elder financial abuse cases in Illinois. I found some information that might be helpful." Sarah had discovered that Dorothy's situation fit a recognized pattern called successor guardianship fraud, where family members systematically documented an elderly person's supposed incompetency to justify court-ordered guardianship that transferred complete control of assets to the petitioners. The good news is that Illinois courts have become very skeptical of family-initiated competency proceedings, especially when there's evidence of financial motivation, Sarah explained. The bad news is that these cases can be incredibly destructive to families, even when the elderly person successfully defends their competency. Dorothy absorbed this information with the grim understanding that her family's betrayal ran deeper than she had initially comprehended. This wasn't about poor investment decisions or misguided paternalism. This was about the deliberate theft of her legal autonomy disguised as protective care. "Sarah," Dorothy said quietly, I think I need to understand that my son and daughter-in-law were planning to have me declared incompetent so they could control my assets and my life decisions. I think that's exactly what was happening, Mom, Sarah replied, her voice carrying both sadness and anger. And I think you caught them before they could complete the process. As Dorothy prepared for bed that night, she looked at Robert's photograph on her dresser, surrounded by evidence of the legal battle that would soon consume her life. They underestimated me, Robert, she whispered to his familiar smile. They assumed that being 73 meant being helpless. Tomorrow they're going to discover exactly how wrong they were. Outside her window, the neighborhood settled into evening quiet. But inside the house on Elmwood Drive, a 73-year-old woman was preparing for the fight of her life against people who had claimed to love her, while planning to steal her freedom. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, autumn air that had always energized Dorothy for important business meetings. She dressed with particular care. The navy blue suit she had worn to sign the sale contract for Sunrise Catering, paired with Robert's mother's pearl earrings that had been passed down through 3 generations of strong women. Today would be the day Marcus Rodriguez delivered his demand letter to Hartwell and Associates, and Dorothy wanted to look like someone who understood exactly how serious business was conducted. The phone rang at 9:15 a.m., precisely when Marcus had predicted it would. Harrison Webb's voice carried none of his usual professional polish, replaced instead by the barely controlled panic of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. "Mrs. Williams," Harrison began, his words tumbling over each other with nervous speed. "I've just received a very concerning letter from your attorney. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about your investment portfolio management." "No misunderstanding at all, Mr. Webb," Dorothy replied, settling into her kitchen chair with the satisfaction of someone watching a long-overdue reckoning unfold. "Your letter accurately describes unauthorized portfolio restructuring, securities fraud, age discrimination, and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. Which part seems unclear to you?" "Mrs. Williams, I want to assure you that Hartwell & Associates takes client satisfaction very seriously. I'm sure we can resolve any concerns through direct dialogue, rather than involving regulatory authorities." Dorothy smiled at the transparent attempt to avoid the nuclear option of State Securities Commission involvement. "Mr. Webb, you had the opportunity for direct dialogue when I first questioned the portfolio changes. Instead, you chose to dismiss my concerns as the confused complaints of an elderly woman who couldn't understand modern finance." She heard papers rustling in the background as Harrison apparently consulted notes or conferred with colleagues. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to the desperate courtesy of someone offering concessions from a position of weakness. "Mrs. Williams, what would it take to resolve this matter to your satisfaction?" Dorothy consulted the legal pad, where she had outlined Marcus's demands with the precision of someone who had spent decades negotiating vendor contracts. Complete reversal of all unauthorized investment changes within 48 hours. Restoration of my original conservative portfolio allocation. Full compensation for losses incurred due to unauthorized risk exposure. That's $247,000 as of yesterday's market close. And a written acknowledgement that no authorization was ever provided for the speculative investments you placed in my account. The silence that followed was so complete that Dorothy wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Harrison's voice returned, noticeably strained. "Mrs. Williams, those demands would require significant regulatory approval and substantial financial adjustments on our part. Perhaps we could negotiate a more mutually acceptable resolution." "Mr. Webb," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the steel that had once convinced difficult clients to meet her catering deadlines. "You seem to be under the impression that this is a negotiation. It's not. It's an ultimatum. You have 48 hours to demonstrate that you understand the difference between legal portfolio management and criminal fraud." After ending the call, Dorothy felt the familiar surge of energy that had always accompanied successful business confrontations. For months, she had been treated like someone whose voice didn't matter, whose concerns could be dismissed, whose intelligence could be questioned. Today, she was reclaiming the authority that age and experience had earned her. Her second call came an hour later, from a number she didn't recognize. The woman's voice was crisp, professional, and carried the kind of focused intensity that suggested important business. "Mrs. Williams, this is Jennifer Chen with the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. We've received some concerning information about potential securities violations involving your investment account at Hartwell & Associates." Dorothy felt her pulse quicken. Marcus had mentioned that regulatory involvement might accelerate resolution, but she hadn't expected the state to move so quickly. "What kind of concerning information?" Dorothy asked. "We've been alerted to possible unauthorized portfolio modifications, forged client documentation, and potential age discrimination in investment recommendations. These are serious allegations that require immediate investigation." Jennifer explained that the department had authority to freeze suspect accounts, conduct forensic audits of investment firms, and pursue both civil and criminal penalties for securities violations. Dorothy's case had been flagged as high priority due to the systematic nature of the alleged violations and the vulnerable population involved. "Mrs. Williams, we'd like to schedule an interview to discuss your experience with Hartwell and Associates. Your testimony could be crucial for determining the scope of potential violations and protecting other elderly investors who might be facing similar exploitation." The realization that her case might protect other seniors from similar abuse added moral weight to Dorothy's pursuit of justice. This wasn't just about recovering her losses. It was about preventing predators from targeting vulnerable elderly investors across the state. "I'll be happy to cooperate fully with your investigation," Dorothy said. "I have extensive documentation of the unauthorized changes and the discriminatory communications." After scheduling her interview with the state regulators, Dorothy found herself in an unexpected position of strength. What had begun as a family conflict over investment losses had evolved into a regulatory investigation that could result in criminal charges and professional sanctions against everyone involved. The phone rang again at 2:30 p.m. This time, the caller was someone Dorothy had never spoken to, but whose reputation she knew well. Patricia Morrison, the senior partner at Morrison, Webb & Associates, a law firm that specialized in defending financial professionals against regulatory investigations. "Mrs. Williams," Patricia said, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "I represent Harrison Webb and Hartwell & Associates in connection with certain regulatory matters. I'm calling to explore whether there might be room for a mutually beneficial resolution of the concerns you've raised." Dorothy recognized the careful language of someone probing for settlement possibilities without admitting wrongdoing. Patricia Morrison's involvement signaled that Hartwell & Associates was taking the regulatory threat seriously enough to hire expensive legal representation. "What kind of resolution did you have in mind?" Dorothy asked. "We're prepared to make significant adjustments to address your concerns about portfolio performance and communication protocols. Mr. Webb is deeply committed to client satisfaction and wants to ensure that any misunderstandings are corrected promptly." Dorothy noted the careful avoidance of terms like fraud, unauthorized changes, or age discrimination. Patricia Morrison was clearly skilled at discussing legal exposure without acknowledging culpability. "Ms. Morrison, I'm not interested in adjustments or protocol improvements. I'm interested in complete restoration of my financial position and acknowledgement that criminal violations occurred. Mrs. Williams, I understand your frustration, but litigation and regulatory proceedings can be lengthy, expensive, and emotionally draining for all parties involved. Sometimes the practical resolution is more valuable than the perfect resolution." Dorothy smiled at the transparent attempt to discourage her from pursuing accountability. "Ms. Morrison, I'm 73 years old. I've weathered the death of my husband, the sale of my business, and the discovery that my own family was planning to have me declared incompetent. I think I can handle the emotional strain of holding people accountable for defrauding me." The conversation ended without resolution, but Dorothy understood that she now occupied the strategic high ground. Hartwell & Associates was sufficiently concerned about regulatory consequences to hire expensive legal representation, while Dorothy had both state investigators and an experienced elder law attorney building her case. At 4 p.m., Michael and Vanessa returned home from their day of managing their startup, their usual energy notably subdued. They found Dorothy in the living room, reviewing documents with the focused attention that had once characterized her preparation for important catering negotiations. "Mom," Michael said carefully, settling onto the couch with the cautious movements of someone navigating unstable ground. "We heard that there's been some regulatory interest in the Hartwell situation." Dorothy looked up from her papers, studying her son's face with the careful attention she had once reserved for reading difficult clients. "News travels fast in the financial services industry," she observed. Vanessa sat beside Michael, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like genuine fear. Mom Williams, we never intended for any of this to escalate to regulatory involvement. We thought this was a family matter that could be resolved privately. A family matter, Dorothy repeated, her voice carrying the edge that had once convinced vendors to meet impossible deadlines. Is that what we call conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse and attempted medical fraud? Michael's face went pale. Mom, what are you talking about? What medical fraud? Dorothy reached for her file and withdrew the documentation of Vanessa's attempt to obtain her medical records under false pretenses. The medical fraud that occurred when your wife called Dr. Henley claiming I was showing signs of cognitive decline and requesting documentation for competency proceedings. She handed Michael the written summary Dr. Henley had provided, watching his expression shift from confusion to horror as he understood the implications of what he was reading. Vanessa, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper, please tell me this isn't what it looks like. Vanessa's composure finally shattered completely. It's not what you think, Michael. I was just trying to understand whether there might be medical explanations for some of the financial decisions she was making. The investment advisor suggested that family members should be alert to signs of age-related decline. Signs of age-related decline, Dorothy said, her voice cutting through Vanessa's explanation like a scalpel. Or evidence that could be used to support a competency hearing that would give you legal control over my assets and my life. The accusation landed with devastating accuracy. Michael stared at his wife with the expression of someone seeing a familiar person transform into a stranger, while Vanessa seemed to shrink into herself, as the full scope of her actions was finally exposed to daylight. Mom, Michael said, his voice carrying the weight of someone understanding their own complicity. I swear to you, I didn't know about any competency proceedings. I thought we were just trying to help you navigate complex financial decisions. Dorothy studied her son's face, seeing genuine shock and horror that suggested his ignorance might be authentic. But she also saw the willful blindness that had enabled Vanessa's more systematic manipulation. Michael, you may not have known about the specific legal strategies, but you knew that you and Vanessa had gradually assumed control over every aspect of my financial life. You knew that decisions were being made about my money without my informed consent. You knew that my concerns were being dismissed as the confused complaints of someone too old to understand modern business. The living room fell silent except for the steady tick of Robert's grandfather clock, marking time in a space where fundamental relationships were being redefined by the collision between good intentions and criminal behavior. What happens now? Vanessa asked, her voice small and defeated. Dorothy looked at these two people who had systematically undermined her autonomy while convincing themselves they were protecting her interests. She thought about Marcus Rodriguez's advice, about the regulatory investigation that was now beyond her control, about the choice between family preservation and personal protection. Now, she said quietly, you discover what it feels like when someone you trusted uses your vulnerabilities against you. Now you learn that good intentions don't excuse criminal behavior. Now you find out whether this family can survive the consequences of treating love like a license to control someone's life. She stood, gathering her documents with the decisive movements of someone who had finally taken full control of their own story. The regulatory investigation will proceed regardless of what I want, Dorothy continued. The state of Illinois takes elder financial abuse seriously, and they're now building a case that could result in criminal charges against everyone involved. Michael and Vanessa sat in stunned silence as Dorothy climbed the stairs to her bedroom, leaving them to confront the reality that their efforts to protect her from poor financial decisions had resulted in potential criminal prosecution for financial crimes. Outside the house on Elmwood Drive, autumn evenings settled over a neighborhood where ordinary families navigated ordinary challenges. But inside Dorothy Williams's home, 3 adults were learning that the most dangerous predators often came disguised as protective family members, and that the cost of underestimating someone because of their age could be measured in years rather than dollars. 3 weeks later, Dorothy sat in the conference room at Rodriguez, Chang & Associates, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction that comes from watching justice unfold with mathematical precision. The mahogany table was covered with settlement documents, regulatory findings, and criminal plea agreements that represented the complete, vindication of her competence, and the total collapse of those who had underestimated her. Marcus Rodriguez reviewed the final settlement terms with the professional satisfaction of an attorney who had built an airtight case. "Mrs. Williams, this is one of the most comprehensive elder abuse settlements I've negotiated in 15 years of practice." The numbers were staggering even to Dorothy, who had spent decades managing complex business transactions. Hartwell and Associates would pay $850,000 in damages, regulatory fines, and legal costs, more than 3 times her original losses. Harrison Webb had surrendered his securities license permanently and agreed to criminal plea bargain that included restitution and community service. The investment firm itself faced a 2-year probationary period under state oversight that would likely destroy their client base and reputation. The regulatory investigation found evidence of systematic age discrimination affecting at least 37 other elderly clients, Marcus explained. "Your willingness to come forward triggered the largest elder financial abuse prosecution in Illinois state history." Dorothy absorbed this information with the quiet pride of someone whose personal courage had protected an entire vulnerable population. What had begun as her private battle against family manipulation had evolved into a statewide crackdown on predatory financial practices targeting seniors. "What about Michael and Vanessa?" Dorothy asked, though she already knew the answer would be complicated. Marcus's expression grew more serious. "The criminal charges against them were dropped in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation and complete restitution of their financial gains from the fraudulent investments. However, they've been banned from acting as financial decision-makers for any elderly person in Illinois, and they're required to complete court-mandated education about elder rights and family financial abuse." The legal consequences were severe but not destructive, exactly what Dorothy had hoped for when she chose accountability over revenge. "They've also agreed to vacate your property within 60 days and to have no involvement in your financial affairs going forward," Marcus continued. "Essentially, they'll be returning to the adult independence they should have maintained in the first place." Dorothy signed the final settlement documents with the same Mont Blanc pen she had used to sign the sale contract for Sunrise Catering, feeling the symbolic weight of reclaiming complete control over her own life. At 73, she was wealthier than she had ever been, legally protected from future exploitation, and surrounded by a professional team that respected her intelligence rather than managing her limitations. The drive home through Maple Grove felt different than it had in months. The familiar street seemed brighter, more welcoming, as if the neighborhood itself was celebrating her victory. Mrs. Patterson waved enthusiastically from her garden, having followed the case through local newspaper coverage that portrayed Dorothy as a local hero who had taken down predatory financial advisors. Inside her house, Dorothy found Michael and Vanessa in the kitchen, surrounded by moving boxes and the subdued atmosphere of people preparing for exile they had brought upon themselves. They looked up when she entered, their faces carrying the complex mixture of shame, relief, and uncertainty that characterized people who had narrowly avoided criminal prosecution. "Mom," Michael said, rising from the table where he had been organizing their belongings, "congratulations on the settlement. You were right to pursue legal action, and we were wrong about everything we did." It was the first unqualified acknowledgement of her competence and their wrongdoing that Dorothy had heard since this crisis began. The absence of defensive qualifications or self-serving explanations suggested that the legal consequences had finally forced genuine understanding of the harm they had caused. "How are the kids handling the move?" Dorothy asked, genuinely concerned about her grandchildren's welfare despite everything their parents had done. Vanessa looked up from packing dishes with red-rimmed eyes that suggested weeks of difficult conversations and emotional reckoning. "We told them that we made serious mistakes that hurt you, and that we need to live somewhere else while we learn how to be better family members." "They're confused and upset," Michael added, "but they understand that actions have consequences. We're hoping that someday, when we've proven we can respect your autonomy, you might be willing to rebuild relationships with all of us." Dorothy studied their faces, seeing genuine remorse that went beyond regret about getting caught. The legal process had apparently forced the kind of self-examination that family confrontation alone couldn't achieve. "Where will you go?" Dorothy asked. "Vanessa's parents have offered us their basement apartment in Rockford," Michael said. "It's not ideal, but it gives us time to rebuild our finances and our lives without imposing on anyone else's generosity. The humble circumstances were a stark contrast to their previous assumptions about optimal living arrangements and family hierarchy. Dorothy felt no satisfaction in their reduced circumstances, but she recognized the necessity of consequences that matched the severity of their violations. "What about your startup?" Dorothy asked. Vanessa's laugh carried bitter irony. "Turns out that investors don't want to fund companies led by people who've been investigated for elder financial abuse. We're both looking for traditional employment while we figure out how to rebuild our professional reputations. The market research for our platform was fundamentally flawed anyway," Michael added with the painful honesty of someone who had been forced to examine their own assumptions. "We assumed that elderly people needed more technological assistance than they actually wanted. We were solving problems that existed more in our prejudices than in reality." Dorothy recognized the deeper lesson embedded in their business failure. The same assumptions about age and competence that had driven their treatment of her had also blinded them to market realities about their target demographic. "I've been thinking about what you said," Vanessa continued, her voice carrying the careful quality of someone who had spent weeks choosing words precisely. "About the difference between helping someone and controlling them. I think I confused making myself feel useful with actually being helpful." She paused, struggling with concepts that clearly hadn't come easily. "I think I was so uncomfortable with uncertainty, about money, about the future, about my own purpose, that I tried to manage everything I could control, including you. Instead of dealing with my own anxiety, I projected it onto you and convinced myself that managing your life would solve both our problems." The psychological insight was more sophisticated than anything Dorothy had expected from Vanessa, suggesting that the crisis had forced genuine self-reflection rather than superficial apology. "What will you do differently going forward?" Dorothy asked. Michael and Vanessa exchanged a look that seemed to contain weeks of difficult conversations and planning. "We've enrolled in family counseling to understand how we develop such controlling patterns," Michael said. "We're working with a therapist who specializes in family financial abuse to understand how good intentions can become harmful behavior. We've also volunteered with the Illinois Department of Aging to help educate other families about respecting elderly autonomy," Vanessa added. "We want to use our experience to prevent other families from making our mistakes." Dorothy felt something shift in her perception of them, a recognition that their consequences were being transformed into community service that might actually benefit other vulnerable seniors. 2 days later, Dorothy stood in her driveway watching the moving truck disappear around the corner, carrying her son's family toward an uncertain future they had created through their own choices. The house felt different already, not empty, but restored to the peaceful sanctuary it had been before well-intentioned invasion had transformed it into a battlefield. Sarah arrived that afternoon for a long-planned visit, bringing her nursing expertise and emotional support for Dorothy's transition back to independent living. They sat in the kitchen where so many family dramas had unfolded, sharing coffee from Dorothy's original china set that had been restored to its place of honor. "How do you feel about everything that's happened?" Sarah asked, studying her mother's face with the professional attention of someone trained to recognize signs of trauma and recovery. Dorothy considered the question that had no simple answer. "I feel vindicated," she said finally. "I feel empowered. I feel grateful that I had the resources and support to fight back effectively. But I also feel sad that it came to this." She paused, gathering thoughts that had been developing over weeks of legal proceedings and family dissolution. "I keep thinking about how easily this could have gone differently. If I hadn't been healthy enough to research my own investments, if I hadn't had access to excellent legal representation, if I hadn't maintained relationships with people who respected my intelligence, I could have ended up under court-ordered guardianship, legally stripped of all autonomy." Sarah nodded gravely. "Mom, what happened to you happens to thousands of elderly people every year. Most of them don't have your resources or your resilience. Most of them just gradually lose control of their lives to family members who convince everyone, including themselves, that they're being protective." The sobering reality added weight to Dorothy's victory. She had not just protected herself, but had demonstrated that elderly people could successfully fight back against systematic exploitation. "What are your plans now?" Sarah asked. Dorothy smiled, reaching for a folder that contained documents Sarah hadn't seen before. "I'm starting a consulting business," she announced. "Elder advocacy services for families navigating financial planning and autonomy issues." She explained her partnership with Marcus Rodriguez's law firm to provide educational workshops for seniors and their families about maintaining independence while accepting appropriate support. The Illinois Department of Aging had already contracted for her services based on her experience and the expertise she had developed through her own case. "I'm also working with Dr. Henley to develop protocols for identifying attempted medical fraud and competency cases," Dorothy continued. "Too many elderly people lose their legal rights because family members manipulate medical professionals into providing documentation for guardianship proceedings." Sarah stared at her mother with something approaching awe. "Mom, you've turned your victimization into a career protecting other people from the same thing." "It seems like the logical next step," Dorothy said simply. "I spent 40 years building a business that fed people. Now I want to spend whatever years I have left protecting people's right to make their own decisions about their lives." As evening approached, Dorothy walked through her house, appreciating the restored sense of sanctuary that came from reclaiming complete control over her environment. In her home office, she reviewed the business plan for Williams Elder Advocacy Services, the company that would transform her hard-won expertise into protection for other vulnerable seniors. The phone rang, interrupting her planning. The caller was Mrs. Patterson, whose voice carried excitement about neighborhood news Dorothy hadn't yet heard. "Dorothy, you'll never guess what happened," Helen said. "The Hendersons got a call today from someone claiming to be their daughter's financial advisor, asking questions about their mental state, and suggesting they might benefit from family assistance with investment decisions." Dorothy felt her protective instincts sharpen. "What did they tell the caller?" "They told them to contact you," Helen said with obvious satisfaction. "Everyone on this block knows you're the person to call when someone tries to take advantage of elderly residents." After hanging up, Dorothy realized that her victory had ripple effects she was only beginning to understand. Her successful resistance to financial exploitation had apparently inspired other seniors to seek her guidance, while deterring predators who now understood that this neighborhood contained people who fought back effectively. She called the Hendersons immediately, offering her assistance in documenting and reporting the attempted fraud. Within an hour, she had connected them with both Marcus Rodriguez and the state regulatory agency that had handled her case. As she prepared for bed that night, Dorothy looked at Robert's photograph with satisfaction rather than longing. "I think you'd be proud," she whispered to his familiar smile. "They said I was too old to understand modern business, but I understood enough to build a business protecting people from exactly the kind of predators who targeted me." Outside her window, the neighborhood settled into evening quiet, but inside the house on Elmwood Drive, a 73-year-old woman was planning the next chapter of a life that had been transformed by the simple decision to refuse victimization and demand respect. Dorothy Williams had proven that age brings wisdom rather than weakness, that experience creates capability rather than limitation, and that underestimating someone because of their birthday is not just disrespectful, it's dangerous, expensive, and likely to result in consequences that extend far beyond the original offense. In learning how to hire a lawyer, she had discovered how to reclaim her power, protect her community, and transform personal injustice into systemic change that would benefit countless other seniors who deserved better than well-intentioned exploitation disguised as family care. The final lesson was simple but profound. Respect isn't something that expires with age. It compounds with experience, and those who forget that truth do so at their own considerable peril. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.